The single mother was humiliated at her son's school event, but what she did next? The hall buzzed with excitement as parents and children filled the decorated space for the school's annual talent showcase. Sophie, a young single mother in her late 20s, held her son, Lucas, by the hand, their steps slightly hesitant as they entered the crowd. Before I continue, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next fantastic stories. Lucas was beaming, his small hand gripping hers tightly as he pointed out friends and decorations. For Sophie, this was a moment of pride. Lucas had worked hard on his performance, and she wanted him to feel the joy of standing on stage, loved and supported. But as she scanned the faces around her, Sophie couldn't help but feel out of place. For months, Sophie had struggled to keep up with the demands of being both a mother and a provider. She worked long hours at a local diner, barely scraping together enough to cover rent, school fees, and essentials. While she dressed as well as she could for tonight, her modest attire stood out among the fashionable clothes and polished appearances of other parents. Whispers followed her as they often did at school events, murmurs from mothers who had formed their own cliques, conversations that never seemed to welcome her. Sophie felt a pang of self-consciousness, but she pushed it aside, focusing on Lucas's excitement. He looked up at her, his face filled with innocent pride. "Are you excited to see my performance, Mom?" he asked, his voice bright with anticipation. She knelt down, looking him in the eyes, and smiled. "I'm so proud of you, Lucas. I wouldn't miss this for the world," she assured him, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. Her words were sincere. This night was as much for her as it was for him, a rare moment to celebrate something she had nurtured. As they found seats near the back, Sophie noticed the glance of a particularly wealthy parent, Claire, who leaned toward her friend and whispered with a smirk. Claire's gaze drifted over Sophie, a mixture of disdain and pity in her eyes. Sophie overheard fragments of their conversation, words like diner and single mother, each one striking a painful chord. She looked away, fighting to keep her composure, reminding herself that she was here for Lucas, not for their approval. The lights dimmed, signaling the start of the performances. Lucas gripped her hand tightly, his small body trembling with nervous energy. Sophie whispered words of encouragement, focusing entirely on him, drowning out the murmurs and stares around her. This was Lucas's night, and nothing would take that away from him, not the whispers, not the disapproving looks, not even the cold judgment she felt like a weight on her shoulders. As the children performed one by one, Sophie applauded each with enthusiasm, despite the way some parents glanced at her, surprised by her energy and support. She felt their judgment keenly, as if every clap was another reminder of her difference, her isolation. She knew the sacrifices she had made, the nights she had gone without sleep or food to make sure Lucas had what he needed. And yet, here she was, viewed as less than by those who had never faced the challenges she had overcome. Finally, it was Lucas's turn. Sophie's heart swelled with pride as he stepped onto the stage, a shy smile lighting up his face. He looked at her from across the room, searching for her reassuring presence, and she smiled back, nodding with encouragement. Lucas took a deep breath and began his performance, a simple yet heartfelt poem about family, about resilience, about love. His words echoed through the hall, touching the hearts of those who were willing to listen. When Lucas finished, Sophie was the first to stand, clapping proudly. Her heart raced with joy, with pride, with love for the little boy who had poured his heart out on that stage. But as she clapped, she felt the sting of whispers around her, the cold shoulders of parents who barely acknowledged her applause. She saw Claire roll her eyes, a look of disdain on her face, as if Sophie's pride was somehow misplaced. And yet, amidst the noise, there was one pair of eyes watching her differently, Daniel, the owner of the school, who had observed Sophie's genuine love and unwavering pride from across the room. As the evening continued, Sophie could still feel the weight of judgment around her, though she tried to ignore it. She focused on Lucas, who was now happily mingling with friends, proudly telling them about his performance. Watching him, her heart filled with warmth and relief. At least for him, tonight had been a success. She busied herself with cleaning up their area, hoping to avoid further attention, when Claire's voice rang out, cutting through her thoughts. "Well, Sophie," Claire said with a forced smile, her tone dripping with condescension, "it's nice to see you could make it tonight. I imagine it must be hard to find time off from the diner. Sophie's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and she forced herself to meet Claire's gaze, trying to maintain her composure. She didn't want to cause a scene, especially not in front of Lucas, but the sting of Claire's words made it difficult to remain calm. I'm always here for my son, no matter what, Sophie replied quietly, keeping her voice steady. She hoped that would be the end of it, but Claire wasn't finished. That's admirable, Claire continued, glancing at her group of friends, who nodded in agreement, smirking. I mean, Lucas deserves all the support he can get. It's inspiring, really, to see someone like you making the effort. The words, laced with judgment, hit Sophie hard. She could feel the tightness in her chest, the urge to defend herself, to make them see that she was more than just a single mother from the diner. But years of navigating these situations had taught her restraint. Sophie took a deep breath, choosing not to respond, instead glancing around for Lucas, who was still engrossed in conversation with his friends. However, Daniel, the school owner, had been watching the interaction from a distance. His brows furrowed as he saw Claire's dismissive gestures and the discomfort on Sophie's face. He hadn't intended to get involved, but the scene bothered him more than he expected. He had noticed Sophie's unwavering dedication to Lucas over the months, her regular presence at every school event, her efforts to support her son despite what was clearly a challenging situation. Daniel quietly approached, interrupting the group with a warm smile directed at Sophie. Sophie, it's great to see you here tonight. Lucas's performance was truly touching, you should be very proud. His voice was kind, carrying a sincerity that took Sophie by surprise. She looked up at him, meeting his steady gaze, feeling a rush of gratitude for his unexpected kindness. Oh, thank you, Mr. Thomas, she replied, flustered yet relieved. Lucas worked really hard. I'm just glad he had this chance. She looked down, shy in the face of his genuine praise, but her heart lifted at his acknowledgement. It was rare for someone in Daniel's position to address her so openly, and it felt like a lifeline in a sea of judgment. Claire looked between Daniel and Sophie, her surprise evident. She cleared her throat, attempting to regain control of the conversation. Yes, it's wonderful that everyone can be included here, she said, her words edged with subtle disdain. We pride ourselves on diversity. Her friends chuckled lightly, their laughter sharp and pointed. Daniel's face remained calm, though his eyes held a quiet firmness. And that's exactly what makes our school special. Everyone here contributes something unique, something important. We're lucky to have families like Sophie's with us. His words were gentle but firm, clearly defending Sophie without directly challenging Claire. He looked at Sophie again, giving her a slight nod, as if to assure her that she had an ally. Sophie's chest swelled with gratitude, and she offered him a small, appreciative smile. For the first time that evening, she felt seen, truly seen. It was as if, in that brief exchange, Daniel had acknowledged not just her presence but her efforts, her worth. She glanced at Lucas, who was still happily unaware of the tension around them, and she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She would continue to fight for him, to make sure he knew he was loved and supported, no matter the obstacles. As Daniel walked away, Claire and her group exchanged glances, clearly unsettled by his unexpected support of Sophie. Well, Claire said finally, her tone icy, it's good to know Mr. Thomas values all backgrounds. She turned away, dismissing Sophie with a flick of her hand, but Sophie no longer cared. Daniel's kindness had strengthened her resolve, and she knew that tonight, she would leave the school with her head held high. As the evening drew to a close, Sophie gathered Lucas and his things, her heart lighter than it had been at the start of the night. She knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but tonight, she felt a shift, a reminder that perhaps not everyone saw her as less than. The days after the school event were filled with the usual routine for Sophie, early mornings, long hours at the diner, and precious moments in between spent with Lucas. Yet, something had shifted within her since that evening. She replayed Daniel's words in her mind, his genuine praise and unwavering support. It was rare for anyone to acknowledge her hard work, and even rarer for someone like him, a respected school owner, to stand up for her so openly. The memory of his kindness felt like a spark in her life, a reminder that she wasn't invisible. Despite this, life continued to present its challenges. One evening, as Sophie sat down to go over her budget, her heart sank. An unexpected medical bill from Lucas's recent checkup had drained more than she'd planned, and her car needed repairs. She bit her lip, feeling the weight of the struggle pressing down on her. The diner job was steady, but barely enough to cover essentials. The added costs felt like mountains she had to climb alone, mountains that never seemed to end. That night, as she tucked Lucas into bed, she found herself lingering beside him, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. His eyes were drooping, but he blinked up at her sleepily, his voice a soft murmur. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, his small hand reaching for hers. Sophie forced a smile, squeezing his hand. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking. Go to sleep, okay?" She kissed his forehead, holding back the tears that threatened to spill. She couldn't let him see her worry. He was her light, her reason to keep going. The following morning, as Sophie prepared to leave for work, she received a surprising phone call. The voice on the other end was calm and polite, introducing himself as a representative from Lucas's school. "Good morning, Ms. Turner," he said. "I'm calling to let you know that Mr. Thomas, our school owner, has invited you to meet with him tomorrow afternoon, if you're available. He'd like to discuss an opportunity regarding your involvement with the school." Sophie's heart raced, and her mind spun with questions. Why would Daniel want to meet with her? She felt a surge of worry, wondering if she had somehow caused a problem. But then she remembered his kindness at the school event, his supportive words. Perhaps this wasn't something to fear. "Yes, of course," she replied, her voice steadying. "I'll make sure to be there." The next day, Sophie arrived at the school, nervous but determined. She wore her best clothes, though they were modest, and she'd carefully pulled her hair back, hoping to make a good impression. As she entered the main office, she was greeted by Daniel's assistant, who led her to his office. The space was warm and inviting, filled with bookshelves, framed certificates, and a large window overlooking the school grounds. Daniel was seated behind his desk, his expression calm and welcoming. "Thank you for coming, Sophie," he greeted her with a warm smile, standing to shake her hand. "Please, have a seat." His voice was as kind and genuine as she remembered, instantly putting her at ease. Sophie sat, her hands clasped in her lap as she waited, her mind racing with curiosity. What could he possibly want to discuss with her? "I'll get straight to the point," Daniel began, his gaze steady. "After the school event, I couldn't help but notice how much you care for Lucas and the lengths you go to support him. It's clear that you're dedicated and resilient, Sophie, and that's something I deeply respect. I wanted to speak with you because I believe you may be able to offer something special to our school community." Sophie's eyes widened, and she felt a surge of both surprise and curiosity. "I'm honored you'd say that, Mr. Thomas," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "But I'm not sure what I could offer. I work at a diner, and my life is, well, it's simple. I don't have any special skills." Daniel leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Sophie, I disagree. It takes a great deal of strength to do what you do. Your resilience, kindness, and dedication are qualities that are rare, and I believe they're exactly what our students and parents could benefit from. We're starting a parent outreach program designed to connect families to resources and build community support. I'd like to invite you to take part in it, and possibly even lead one of the initiatives." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She had never expected an opportunity like this, and certainly not from someone like Daniel. "Mr. Thomas, I don't know what to say. I'd love to be involved, but I'm not sure if I'm qualified for something like that." Daniel's smile softened, his gaze reassuring. "You're more than qualified, Sophie. Sometimes, it's not about formal qualifications but the heart and empathy someone brings to the role. I believe you have that, and I think you could make a real difference here." He paused, his tone gentle. "This role would come with a modest salary, which I know may be helpful. But more than that, it would be a chance for you to use your experiences to help others who may be going through similar struggles." Sophie felt a wave of emotion rise within her, a mixture of hope, disbelief, and gratitude. For so long, she had seen herself as just a single mother scraping by, working tirelessly for her son's future. But here was someone who saw something more in her, who was giving her a chance not only to better her own life but to impact the lives of others. Taking a deep breath, she looked up, her eyes meeting Daniel's. Thank you, Mr. Thomas. I would be honored to be part of this program. I never thought I'd have an opportunity like this. Her voice shook slightly, but her resolve was clear. She knew that this was her moment, a chance to step out of the shadows and take on a role she never imagined for herself. As they finished their conversation, Daniel gave her a few details about the program and assured her that the school would provide training and support to help her succeed. Sophie left the meeting with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She felt as if she were finally being seen, not just as a single mother struggling to get by, but as a woman with the strength to make a difference. Walking back to her apartment that evening, Sophie thought of Lucas and the future she wanted for him. For the first time, she felt as though she could offer him more than just the basics. She could give him a role model, someone who stood up for herself and others, who refused to be limited by her circumstances. She was determined to make the most of this opportunity, not only for herself but for him, too. As she tucked Lucas into bed that night, he looked up at her with his bright, trusting eyes. "Mom, you look happy," he said, his voice filled with innocent observation. Sophie smiled, feeling her heart swell. "I am, Lucas," she replied softly. "Good things are happening. And I promise, we're going to have a brighter future." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change for Sophie. She juggled shifts at the diner with training sessions for the parent outreach program, absorbing everything Daniel and the school staff shared with her. Despite the exhaustion, she felt more alive than she had in years. Each day, she woke with a renewed sense of purpose, a belief that she was building a better future for Lucas and, in some small way, for other parents who struggled as she had. The parent outreach program began slowly, with a handful of families coming to her first meeting. Sophie was nervous, unsure if anyone would take her seriously. But as she stood in front of the small group, her voice steady, she noticed the attentive faces of other mothers and fathers who had stories like hers, people who worked long hours, who faced judgments, who knew the difficulty of trying to raise children without a solid foundation of support. She shared her own journey with them, speaking openly about the challenges of single parenthood and the weight of loneliness. "It's hard," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "to feel like you're constantly judged or overlooked. But we're stronger together. We can support each other." Her words resonated, and for the first time, she saw not just polite smiles but genuine interest in their eyes. After the meeting, several parents came up to her, thanking her for speaking so honestly. Sophie felt a flicker of pride. She was making a difference. One evening after a particularly successful meeting, Daniel stopped by to check in. "I heard tonight's meeting went well," he said, his expression warm. Sophie smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment. "It did. I think people are starting to open up," she replied. "It's amazing to see how much we all have in common, even if our situations are different." She paused, glancing at him with a shy smile. "I owe this opportunity to you. Thank you for believing in me." Daniel's gaze softened, and he gave a small nod. "I only helped you find the path, Sophie. You're the one making a difference. I've seen the way parents look at you, the way they trust you. You've created a safe space here, and that's something special." His words filled her with a quiet pride, and she felt the stirrings of something she hadn't felt in a long time, confidence in herself. As her responsibilities grew, so did the outreach program. Word spread quickly, and soon, parents who hadn't initially attended began to join. They shared stories of hardship, leaned on each other, and even offered practical help, like rides to work or advice on affordable childcare. Sophie found herself leading a small but powerful network of support, one that was breaking down the isolation so many parents felt. She saw in their eyes a sense of belonging, and it reminded her of the strength she had once longed for. One day, during a break at the diner, Sophie received an unexpected visit from Claire. The same Claire who had humiliated her at the school event now stood in front of her with an uneasy smile. "Sophie," she began, her tone polite but guarded, "I've heard about the work you're doing with the parent outreach program. I wanted to say that I think it's very commendable." Claire's words surprised Sophie, but she kept her expression neutral, waiting for her to continue. Claire hesitated, fidgeting slightly. I didn't realize how much you've had to manage on your own," she admitted, her voice softer now. "I know I may have come off as unsupportive before. But I'd like to help, if you'd let me." Sophie looked at her, taken aback by the shift in Claire's attitude. Part of her wanted to hold onto the resentment she'd felt, to remember the sting of Claire's judgment. But another part of her, the part that had grown through her work in the outreach program, wanted to offer grace. Sophie nodded slowly. "Thank you, Claire. I appreciate your willingness to help." The words felt strange, but genuine. "I think we all have something we can give." She could see the relief in Claire's eyes, a softening that told her the apology was sincere. They spoke for a few minutes, discussing ideas for the program, and by the end of the conversation, Sophie felt a cautious sense of camaraderie. It was strange how things had changed, how the very people who had once dismissed her were now seeing her in a new light. As the weeks passed, Claire joined the program, helping to organize events and connecting Sophie with other parents who had felt out of place. The partnership was tentative at first, but over time, Sophie noticed that Claire's support seemed genuine. Together, they were able to reach even more families, creating a stronger network of understanding and compassion. One evening, after a long day at the school, Daniel invited Sophie to stay for coffee in his office. She agreed, grateful for a moment to relax. They talked about the outreach program's success, but their conversations soon turned to their own lives. Sophie found herself opening up to him about her past, the struggles she had endured as a young mother with no support. Daniel listened intently, his gaze unwavering, and Sophie felt a warmth in his presence, a sense of safety she hadn't felt in a long time. "Sophie," he said after a pause, his voice gentle, "you have an incredible strength. I hope you know that." His words made her blush, but she met his gaze, feeling a connection she couldn't quite explain. She had admired him from afar, his kindness and respect for everyone at the school, but now, sitting here in the quiet warmth of his office, she realized she was beginning to feel something more. As they finished their coffee, Daniel walked her to the door, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "Thank you for everything you're doing here," he said, his voice soft. "This school is a better place because of you." Sophie smiled, her heart racing. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a quiet happiness she hadn't known she was missing. On her way home, Sophie replayed the evening in her mind, a mixture of gratitude and newfound hope filling her. She had come so far from the days of feeling unseen and unworthy. Through her own courage and Daniel's unwavering support, she was creating a life she could be proud of, a life that, for the first time, seemed filled with possibilities. In the weeks that followed, Sophie's role in the school community continued to expand. Her outreach program had transformed from a small initiative into something truly impactful, a safe haven for parents from all walks of life. Her modest income from the role provided a cushion she hadn't expected, allowing her to reduce her hours at the diner. The relief was immense. For the first time in years, she was able to spend more evenings at home with Lucas, helping him with his homework, reading stories, and enjoying the simple, priceless moments she'd missed before. With every success, Sophie's confidence grew. She attended school functions with a newfound sense of pride, no longer feeling like an outsider. Parents who had once ignored her now greeted her warmly, asking her advice and including her in their conversations. She still couldn't quite believe how much her life had changed. Each evening, when she looked at Lucas's beaming face and saw the joy in his eyes, she knew she was building a future for him, a life rooted not in scarcity, but in strength. One afternoon, Daniel asked Sophie to meet him in his office. Her heart fluttered slightly, as it always did in his presence. Their coffee chats had become a cherished part of her routine, and she found herself looking forward to them in a way she hadn't anticipated. She felt a deepening connection with Daniel, an understanding that went beyond words, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Today, though, his tone sounded serious, and she wondered what he wanted to discuss. When she arrived, Daniel was standing by the window, gazing thoughtfully at the playground below where children played, their laughter filling the air. He turned when he heard her enter, a warm smile lighting up his face. "Sophie, thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." She sat across from him, noticing the hint of excitement in his expression. "I wanted to discuss the future of the outreach program with you," he began, his voice filled with enthusiasm. Sophie nodded, intrigued. "Of course. What's on your mind?" she asked, eager to hear his thoughts. Daniel leaned forward, his hands clasped together as he spoke. "The program has been a tremendous success, Sophie. You've created something truly remarkable here. I believe it's time to expand, possibly into a more permanent role for you." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We'd like to make this a full-time position, with increased responsibilities and a salary that reflects your contribution to the school." Sophie's breath caught, her heart racing with a mixture of disbelief and joy. A full-time role? It was more than she had ever hoped for. The possibility of leaving the diner altogether, of focusing fully on the work she loved, felt like a dream. I don't know what to say, Daniel," she stammered, her voice thick with emotion. "This is incredible. I never imagined." "Thank you." Daniel smiled, his gaze steady and warm. "You deserve this, Sophie. You've poured your heart into this program, and the impact you've made is undeniable. The school is lucky to have you." His words filled her with pride, but she also felt a deeper warmth in his gaze, a connection that had grown stronger with each passing day. She looked at him, her own gratitude and admiration reflected back in his eyes, and felt her heart swell. Later that evening, Sophie returned home to Lucas, her excitement barely contained. She gathered him close, beaming as she shared the news. "Lucas, guess what? I'm going to be working at the school full-time," she told him, her voice bubbling with joy. Lucas's eyes lit up, and he threw his arms around her. "Really, Mom? That's amazing," he exclaimed. "Does this mean you won't have to work at the diner anymore?" Sophie nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Yes, sweetheart. This means I'll be able to spend more time with you, and we can start thinking about some of the things we've been wishing for." The thought of finally being able to save, to provide a better life for Lucas, was almost overwhelming. She felt like she was on the edge of something truly wonderful, a future she had once only dreamed of. As the days passed, Sophie settled into her new role, pouring even more energy and passion into the program. She hosted workshops, led support groups, and organized events that brought parents together, strengthening the bonds within the community. Daniel continued to be a steady presence, offering guidance and support, though their relationship had shifted. There was an ease between them now, a friendship that was both professional and personal, filled with respect, trust, and something unspoken that hung in the air whenever they were alone. One Friday evening, after a particularly successful parent workshop, Daniel invited Sophie to join him for dinner. They found a cozy restaurant nearby, and for the first time, Sophie saw him outside of the school setting, relaxed and casual. They laughed over shared memories, stories of their own childhoods, and dreams for the future. Sophie found herself confiding in him in a way she hadn't with anyone in years. She told him of her struggles, her fears, and her deepest hopes for Lucas. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere shifted. There was a quiet tension between them, a feeling that had been growing but left unspoken. Daniel reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Sophie," he began softly, his voice steady, "I've watched you grow, overcome so much, and turn your life into something truly extraordinary. And I can't help but admire the woman you are. The strength you carry, it's something rare." Sophie's heart pounded, her cheeks flushing. She met his gaze, the intensity in his eyes making her breath catch. "Daniel, I don't know what to say. You've been so kind to me, to Lucas. I never thought someone would see me like this." Her voice trembled, but she held his gaze, feeling a warmth she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze, his expression tender. "Sophie, I don't want to just be a friend or a colleague. I care about you, deeply. And I'd like to see where this could go, if you're open to it." His words were sincere, filled with a vulnerability that made her feel both seen and valued. She nodded, a smile breaking through her tears. "I'd like that too, Daniel." They left the restaurant hand in hand, a new beginning unfolding between them. For the first time in years, Sophie felt cherished, not just as a mother or as a struggling woman, but as a person worthy of love. She looked up at Daniel, feeling her heart settle into a warmth she had once thought lost forever. This was the start of something beautiful, and she knew, with him by her side, that she and Lucas had finally found a home. Over the next few weeks, Sophie's life blossomed in ways she hadn't dared to imagine. Her role at the school became more fulfilling as she connected deeply with parents, many of whom relied on her for support and guidance. The outreach program now had a steady stream of families who found comfort in sharing their challenges, and Sophie was at the heart of it all. The steady income, the stability, the sense of purpose, all of it was more than she'd ever hoped for. And alongside her professional fulfillment, something even more beautiful was unfolding with Daniel. Their relationship grew quietly at first, a shared understanding that didn't need to be announced but was evident in every stolen glance, every shared smile, every gentle touch. Daniel, always considerate of her situation, respected her pace, allowing their bond to develop naturally. He would visit her and Lucas often, staying for dinner or joining them at the park, where Lucas would challenge him to playful races and show off his latest discoveries. Sophie watched as Lucas grew closer to Daniel, and her heart swelled with joy at seeing her son so happy. One evening, as Sophie put Lucas to bed, he looked up at her with a serious expression. "Mom, do you think Mr. Daniel could be my friend forever?" he asked, his small voice filled with hope. Sophie felt her heart tighten, her love for her son mixed with the happiness and uncertainty of a new relationship. She stroked his hair gently, smiling down at him. "I think so, sweetheart. Mr. Daniel cares about us a lot," she replied, her voice warm. "He's a special person, and he makes us feel safe, doesn't he?" Lucas nodded, satisfied with her answer, and drifted off to sleep with a smile on his face. Sophie watched him for a moment, a surge of gratitude filling her heart. It had been a long journey to this place of security, warmth, and love, and she cherished every moment. As she returned to the living room, she found Daniel waiting, sitting with a relaxed smile as he looked through some of Lucas's drawings that were spread across the table. He glanced up when she entered, his gaze filled with a warmth that made her feel both treasured and at ease. "Your son has quite the imagination," he remarked with a chuckle. "I think he might have a future as an artist." Sophie laughed, sitting beside him. "He does get lost in his little worlds. I think it helps him express what he can't put into words," she said thoughtfully, her gaze drifting to the drawing of a superhero Lucas had made, a hero with a big smile and a hand extended to a smaller figure. She realized that the hero was clearly inspired by Daniel, and the thought made her heart swell. They sat together in silence, comfortable and close, until Daniel turned to her, his expression more serious. "Sophie, I want you to know something," he began, his voice low and sincere. "Being here with you and Lucas, it's become the best part of my life. I know we've been taking things slowly, but I want you to know that I'm here for you, for both of you, in every way." His words touched her deeply, and she felt a warmth spread through her, a reassurance that grounded her heart. She looked at him, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Daniel, you've done so much for us already. More than I can ever repay. You've given me a chance, a place to belong, and," she paused, her voice faltering as she tried to find the words to express the depth of her gratitude. "You've made me feel like I deserve happiness, like I deserve this life." She took a breath, feeling her emotions rise. "And Lucas, he looks up to you in a way he's never looked at anyone else." Daniel's face softened, and he reached for her hand, his touch gentle yet firm. "You don't owe me anything, Sophie. You and Lucas, just being part of your lives has been a gift." He paused, his gaze intense, his next words carrying a weight that made her heart skip. "I don't want to just be here for now, Sophie. I want to be here for the long run. I want to be someone Lucas can rely on, someone he can call family, if you'll let me." Tears filled Sophie's eyes, and she nodded, unable to hold back the smile that spread across her face. "I'd like that, Daniel. More than anything." She squeezed his hand, a quiet happiness settling over them, a promise that their relationship was more than just a fleeting moment. It was a commitment to a future, a life where they could build something together. The following weekend, Daniel planned a special outing for Sophie and Lucas, a trip to a nearby lake where they could spend the day together. They packed a picnic, blankets, and games, Lucas chattering excitedly the entire ride there. When they arrived, Daniel and Lucas raced to the water, skipping stones and laughing as they tried to outdo each other. Sophie watched them, her heart swelling with love for the man who had come into their lives so unexpectedly but had already given them so much. As they ate lunch under the shade of a large tree, Lucas, his mouth full of sandwiches, looked at Daniel with a question. "Mr. Daniel, do you think you could stay with us forever?" he asked innocently, his eyes wide with hope. Sophie felt her breath catch, her gaze shifting to Daniel, who looked at her with a gentle smile before turning to Lucas. "I would love that, buddy," Daniel said softly, placing a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "I'll be here for you and your mom as long as you both want me to be. I promise." The sincerity in his voice reassured both Lucas and Sophie, a promise she knew he intended to keep. Lucas beamed, and Sophie felt a tear slip down her cheek, overwhelmed by the happiness and security this moment held. As the sun began to set, they packed up and walked back to the car, Lucas nestled between them, his small hands holding theirs. Sophie felt as if her life had come full circle, from the lonely struggles she had endured to this, a life where she was not only supported but cherished. She had a family now, a future, and a man who loved her for everything she was. That night, as she tucked Lucas into bed, he looked up at her with sleepy eyes. "Mom, today was the best day ever," he murmured, his voice filled with contentment. Sophie leaned down, kissing his forehead. "I think so too, sweetheart," she whispered, feeling her heart fill with love and gratitude. As she joined Daniel in the living room, he pulled her into his arms, holding her close. In his embrace, Sophie felt truly at home. They had built something beautiful together, something rooted in respect, trust, and love. And as she looked into his eyes, she knew that this was only the beginning of a lifetime filled with love, security, and the family she had always dreamed of. Over the next few months, Sophie and Daniel's relationship deepened, and their lives continued to intertwine in the most natural ways. What had once been a simple routine for Sophie now held warmth and joy, as if a piece she hadn't known was missing had finally fallen into place. She could feel it in the small things, the way Daniel would surprise her by picking up Lucas from school, the dinners they shared together, the late-night conversations where they spoke of dreams, fears, and hopes for the future. For the first time, Sophie felt what it meant to share her life with someone. The parent outreach program at the school had also grown tremendously, thanks to Sophie's dedication and Daniel's support. Parents from all backgrounds found solace in the group she led, finding strength in each other's stories. Sophie's compassion and experience made her a confidant to many, and she often found herself staying late after meetings, listening to others, offering advice, and even organizing fundraisers to help struggling families. The community's gratitude filled her with purpose, making her feel connected in a way she hadn't before. One evening, as Sophie was tidying up after a long day, she found Daniel waiting for her in her office with a thoughtful expression. "How about we go for a walk?" he asked, extending his hand with a gentle smile. Surprised but delighted, Sophie agreed, taking his hand as they walked through the empty hallways of the school and out into the evening air. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over the playground where Lucas often played. They walked in comfortable silence, letting the quiet and beauty of the evening settle around them. Daniel glanced at her, a soft smile playing on his lips. "Sophie, I've been wanting to talk to you about something," he began, his tone serious but warm. She looked up at him, her heart quickening as she sensed the gravity in his voice. "These past months with you and Lucas, they've meant everything to me. I never thought I'd find this kind of happiness, this sense of family. Being with you both has filled my life with a joy I didn't know I was missing." Sophie felt a lump in her throat, her hand tightening around his. "You've given us so much, Daniel." "More than I can put into words," she replied softly, her voice filled with emotion. "You've shown me what it means to feel safe, supported, loved." Her cheeks flushed slightly at the word, but she held his gaze, knowing it was the truth. She loved him deeply, in a way that had grown slowly but had now taken root in her heart. Daniel stopped walking, turning to face her fully. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, delicate ring with a single sapphire. Sophie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as her eyes filled with tears. "Sophie Turner," he said, his voice steady yet filled with emotion, "I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to be there for Lucas as he grows, to support you in all your dreams. Will you marry me?" Sophie felt overwhelmed by a wave of joy, gratitude, and love. This was the man who had seen her at her lowest, who had been there for her when she felt invisible and undervalued. He had believed in her, respected her, and loved her not in spite of her struggles, but because of the strength she'd shown through them. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded, her voice trembling. "Yes, Daniel. Yes, 1,000 times yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, and they embraced, a quiet joy settling over them. They stood there for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, as the weight of their commitment filled the air. Sophie felt a profound sense of peace, as if all the hardships she'd endured had led her to this moment, this man who cherished her and her son with all his heart. In the days that followed, the news of their engagement spread quickly among friends and family. Lucas was thrilled, jumping up and down when he learned that Mr. Daniel would officially become part of their family. "Does this mean I get to call you Dad?" he asked Daniel one evening, his eyes filled with hope. Daniel knelt down to Lucas's level, his voice thick with emotion. "Only if that's what you want, Lucas." "I'd be honored," he replied, his voice gentle. Lucas nodded eagerly, wrapping his arms around Daniel, his face beaming with happiness. Sophie watched them, her heart swelling with a love so deep it felt endless. She knew that Daniel had not only become her partner, but he was also becoming a father to Lucas, a figure of support, strength, and kindness that her son had longed for. And knowing that Lucas felt safe and loved filled Sophie with an indescribable happiness. As they began planning their life together, Daniel suggested moving into a larger home that would give them more space and a backyard where Lucas could play. At first, Sophie hesitated, worried about leaving behind the modest apartment she had worked so hard to keep. But Daniel reassured her, emphasizing that this new home would be theirs together, a fresh start built on shared dreams. A few weeks later, they found the perfect house on the edge of town. It was a warm, inviting place with enough space for family dinners, cozy evenings, and laughter-filled weekends. Sophie fell in love with it instantly, imagining the memories they would create there, the stability and happiness it would bring to Lucas. She could see herself growing old with Daniel in this house, watching Lucas grow up, perhaps even building a family beyond what she had thought possible. On the day they moved in, friends from the school and members of Sophie's outreach program came to help. The sense of community, of love and support, overwhelmed her. It was more than she had ever imagined. As she stood in the living room surrounded by the people who had helped her get to this point, she felt a deep gratitude for every step of her journey. She knew it hadn't been easy, but looking around at the home they'd created, she felt that every hardship had led her here. That evening, as the sun set over their new home, Daniel, Sophie, and Lucas sat on the back porch, watching the stars appear one by one. Sophie rested her head on Daniel's shoulder, his arm wrapped around her as Lucas leaned against her side, his eyes heavy with sleep. "This feels like a dream," she murmured, her voice filled with wonder. "Like everything I ever wished for but never thought I'd have." Daniel looked at her, his voice soft and full of love. "It's real, Sophie. And it's just the beginning." He kissed her forehead, holding her close as they sat in silence, their hearts filled with a quiet, steady happiness that felt like home. And as they sat there, Sophie knew that this was the life she had fought for, the life she had dared to believe in when all seemed lost. She had found love, family, and a home, not just a physical place, but a life where she was valued, respected, and cherished. For the first time, she felt whole, ready to embrace all the beauty that lay ahead. Life settled into a beautiful rhythm for Sophie, Daniel, and Lucas in their new home. The house quickly filled with the sounds of laughter and warmth as they adjusted to their life together. Each morning began with the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen, Lucas chatting excitedly about his plans for the day, and Sophie feeling the soft touch of Daniel's hand on her back as they prepared breakfast together. These small moments, the simple joys, were what Sophie cherished most. After years of struggle, she finally felt secure and at peace. The outreach program continued to thrive under Sophie's leadership, growing to include even more families who needed support. She had transformed it into a true community, a place where parents could share openly without judgment. One of her recent projects was a resource fair for families, organized to provide free clothing, school supplies, and information on local services. Sophie poured her heart into it, driven by a desire to make a tangible difference in the lives of others. Daniel had been an incredible partner in the project, handling logistics and using his connections to bring in sponsors and donations. They spent countless hours working side by side, each inspired by the other's dedication. Late into the night, they would sit at the kitchen table, finalizing details and sharing ideas, their bond growing stronger with every shared goal. They had become not just partners in life but also partners in purpose, working toward a common dream of building a stronger community. One evening, as they were preparing for the upcoming fair, Daniel paused, looking at her with a mix of admiration and pride. "Sophie, I've watched you transform this program into something incredible. You've built a community where people feel seen, heard, and valued. Do you realize the impact you're making?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine respect. Sophie blushed, looking down but unable to hide her smile. I know what it feels like to be invisible, to struggle alone. I want people to feel like they have someone on their side." Daniel placed a hand over hers, his gaze warm. "You're not just helping people, you're inspiring them, Sophie. You're showing them that it's possible to rise above hardship, to find strength in vulnerability." His words touched her deeply, and she felt a wave of gratitude for his unwavering support. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," she replied softly. "You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." The day of the resource fair arrived, and Sophie felt a blend of excitement and nerves. They had transformed the school gymnasium into a welcoming space filled with tables of supplies, information booths, and a small play area for children. Sophie arrived early, her heart racing as she took in the sight of the community coming together. Parents and volunteers bustled around, setting up displays, arranging donated items, and creating a warm, inviting environment. As families began to arrive, Sophie moved through the crowd, greeting parents and helping children pick out school supplies. She watched as parents found comfort in each other's company, sharing stories, laughter, and even a few tears. It was everything she had hoped for, a space where people felt connected, supported, and cared for. And as she looked around, she felt an overwhelming sense of pride in what they had built together. During a quieter moment, Sophie spotted Claire, who had also come to help. Over time, their tentative partnership had grown into a genuine friendship, and Sophie valued Claire's dedication to the program. She watched as Claire helped a young mother with a stroller, her once guarded demeanor softened by a kindness that Sophie hadn't initially seen. Claire caught Sophie's eye and smiled, giving her a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of their shared purpose and respect. Later that day, Sophie found herself drawn to a woman who stood at the edge of the room, looking hesitant and a bit overwhelmed. She was holding the hand of a young child, her eyes darting around nervously. Sophie approached her with a warm smile, recognizing the look of uncertainty and self-doubt that she herself had once felt. "Hi, I'm Sophie. I'm so glad you're here," she said gently, her voice calm and welcoming. The woman looked at her, surprise flickering in her eyes before she relaxed slightly. "Thank you," she murmured, glancing at her child. I didn't know if I should come. I didn't want to intrude." Sophie felt a pang of empathy and reached out, touching her arm reassuringly. "You're not intruding at all. This is for you, for everyone who needs a little help or support. I know what it feels like to stand where you are." The woman's eyes softened, and she nodded, a faint smile breaking through her initial apprehension. Sophie led her through the fair, helping her pick out items for her child and introducing her to other parents. By the end of the afternoon, the woman looked visibly lighter, her shoulders no longer tense, her face lit with a new sense of belonging. Sophie felt a rush of pride. Moments like these were why she had started the program in the first place. As the fair came to a close, Daniel found her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as they watched the last families leave, their bags filled and their hearts a little fuller. "You did it, Sophie," he said, his voice filled with pride. "Today, you showed people they are not alone." Sophie leaned into him, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. "We did it together," she replied, looking up at him, her eyes filled with warmth. That evening, as they returned home, exhausted but fulfilled, Sophie felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. Their lives had become a beautiful blend of purpose and partnership, filled with shared dreams and unwavering support. She knew that she was no longer the woman who felt small and invisible. She had found her voice, her strength, and a man who cherished her for everything she was. As they put Lucas to bed, he looked up at them, his eyes sleepy but filled with happiness. "Mom, today was amazing. I'm proud of you," he murmured, wrapping his small arms around her. Sophie's heart swelled, and she kissed his forehead. "Thank you, sweetheart." "I'm proud of us, all of us," she replied, her voice soft but filled with conviction. Later that night, as Sophie and Daniel sat together on the porch, watching the stars in comfortable silence, Sophie felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the life they were building. It hadn't been easy, and there were days when she still felt traces of self-doubt, but with Daniel by her side and the strength she'd found within herself, she knew they could face anything. Together, they were creating a life filled with love, hope, and purpose, a life that went beyond survival and reached into the heart of what it meant to truly live. In the months that followed, Sophie, Daniel, and Lucas settled fully into their new life, each day weaving them closer together as a family. The house echoed with laughter and warmth, and there was a steady rhythm to their days that felt both comforting and filled with possibility. They shared meals, stories, and dreams, creating traditions that filled their home with love and joy. For Sophie, this life was more than she had ever dared to imagine. And though she had once feared that happiness could be fleeting, each day reassured her that this was real, that this was home. The outreach program continued to thrive, expanding in ways Sophie hadn't anticipated. She organized classes on budgeting, parenting, and stress management, inviting local experts to speak and offer guidance. Her passion and dedication inspired the community, and soon, the school began receiving recognition for the success of the program. Parents from nearby schools even reached out, eager to participate in what had become a lifeline for so many. Sophie's work was changing lives, and the realization filled her with pride and a sense of accomplishment she had never felt before. One Friday evening, Daniel surprised her with a special dinner to celebrate her recent accomplishments. As she entered their dining room, she found the table beautifully set, candles flickering softly, and a bouquet of fresh flowers at the center. She looked up at Daniel, a smile spreading across her face. "You did all this?" she asked, touched by his thoughtfulness. He nodded, pulling her chair out for her, his eyes warm with admiration. "You deserve this, Sophie. You've created something incredible, and I wanted to honor that." As they ate, their conversation drifted from the program to their plans for the future. Daniel shared his hopes for expanding the school's resources to accommodate more families, while Sophie spoke about her vision for growing the outreach program even further. "There are so many people we could reach," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "If we could bring in more volunteers, maybe even secure some funding, we could create something that lasts, a program that continues to support families for years to come." Daniel reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I have no doubt that you'll make it happen, Sophie. You've already done so much." His voice was filled with conviction, and she felt her confidence rise. His belief in her had been a constant source of strength, and in that moment, she realized just how much she wanted to continue building this life with him by her side. As the evening went on, they spoke not only of the program but of more personal dreams. They discussed future trips they wanted to take with Lucas, memories they hoped to make, and even ideas for expanding their family. The thought of another child filled Sophie with both excitement and a touch of apprehension. She had raised Lucas alone for so long, and while she loved him with all her heart, she had never imagined having more children, until now. Sensing her hesitation, Daniel squeezed her hand, his voice gentle. "We don't have to decide anything right now," he assured her, his gaze warm and understanding. "But whatever the future holds, I want you to know that I'm here, for every step. You don't have to carry it all alone anymore." His words brought tears to Sophie's eyes, and she felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. He wasn't just her partner, he was her support, her confidant, her family. The next day, as Sophie sat in her office at the school, she was surprised to receive a visit from one of the local news reporters. Word of the outreach program's success had spread, and the reporter was interested in doing a feature on her work. "Your story is so inspiring," the reporter said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "We'd love to highlight the impact you're making in the community. Would you be open to an interview?" Sophie felt a mixture of pride and disbelief. It was hard to fathom that the program, born from her own experiences and struggles, had grown into something that was garnering attention beyond their community. She agreed, and over the next few days, she worked with the reporter to share the story of the program, her journey, and the people whose lives had been touched by it. When the article was published, the response was overwhelming. Parents, teachers, and even local business owners reached out, offering their support and resources to help expand the program. Sophie was deeply moved, realizing that her dream of creating something lasting, something that would help others long into the future, was closer to becoming a reality. One evening, after putting Lucas to bed, Sophie sat with Daniel on their back porch, the newspaper open between them, the article about the outreach program highlighted on the front page. She looked up at him, her voice filled with emotion. "I never thought this would happen, Daniel. I was just a single mom, struggling to get by. I never imagined that my story could inspire people." Her voice trembled slightly, and Daniel wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "You're so much more than that, Sophie," he said softly, his gaze filled with pride. "You've turned your pain into something beautiful, something that helps others. That takes incredible strength, and you should be proud." Sophie leaned into him, a sense of peace washing over her as she took in his words. She realized that her journey had been about more than survival. It had been about finding her voice, her purpose, and her strength. As they sat in silence, gazing at the stars, Daniel spoke again, his voice filled with warmth. "There's something I wanted to ask you, Sophie." She looked up at him, curious, her heart skipping a beat. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small envelope. "This is for you," he said, handing it to her with a smile. She opened the envelope, finding inside 2 plane tickets. Sophie looked at him in surprise, a smile spreading across her face as she realized where they were for. A family trip to a beautiful beach destination she had once mentioned in passing. "I thought it would be nice for us to take a break, to enjoy some time together as a family," Daniel said, his voice soft. "You've worked so hard, Sophie. You deserve this." Tears filled Sophie's eyes as she looked at him, overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you, Daniel," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "I've never felt this kind of happiness, this kind of love." She reached for his hand, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the life they were building, for the future they were creating together. As they embraced, Sophie felt a quiet joy settle over her. The challenges they had faced, the struggles she had endured, they had all led her here, to this moment, to this man who had become her home. And as they sat together, their hearts full of love and hope, Sophie knew that they were just beginning a beautiful new chapter, one filled with dreams, purpose, and endless possibilities. Just as Sophie felt she was finally on solid ground, life threw her a curveball she never saw coming. One evening, Daniel was running late from a business meeting. He'd planned to pick up Lucas from school, but as the clock ticked past the usual time, Sophie received a call from the school office. They let her know that Lucas was safe, but waiting, and that Daniel hadn't arrived. Panic sparked within her, as Daniel was never late without a call. She quickly picked up Lucas herself, her mind racing as she wondered why he hadn't called or answered her texts. Finally, her phone rang, and she answered with a shaky voice, her heart pounding. But it wasn't Daniel's voice on the other end, it was a stranger, speaking in a grave tone that made her knees weaken. "Miss Turner, I'm calling from the local hospital. Daniel Thomas has been in an accident. He's stable, but we need you to come in right away." Sophie's mind went blank as the weight of those words hit her. She grabbed Lucas's hand, her voice steady despite the panic coursing through her. "Sweetheart, we're going to see Mr. Daniel, okay? He's just had a little accident." The drive to the hospital felt like a blur, and when they arrived, she was directed to a small waiting room near the emergency ward. Minutes felt like hours as Sophie sat clutching Lucas's hand, her mind spinning with worry and dread. Finally, a doctor appeared, a look of exhaustion on his face. "Are you family?" he asked, and Sophie nodded. She didn't know if it was true in the legal sense, but in her heart, she was his family. The doctor's expression softened, and he guided her to a chair. "Daniel's injuries are serious," the doctor explained, his voice low but steady. "He suffered head trauma, as well as injuries to his spine and ribs. He's stable now, but it's going to be a long road to recovery. We'll need to monitor him closely in the coming days to assess the extent of the damage." Sophie felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under her. She wanted to scream, to cry, to demand why this had happened to them, but she swallowed her emotions, knowing that she needed to be strong for Lucas. "Can I see him?" she whispered, and the doctor nodded, leading her to Daniel's room. The sight of him lying there, pale and still, with machines beeping softly around him, broke her heart. She took his hand gently, tears streaming down her cheeks as she whispered, "We're here, Daniel. Lucas and we're right here." Days blurred into weeks as Sophie juggled hospital visits, her work, and caring for Lucas, whose young mind struggled to grasp the severity of Daniel's condition. Friends and members of the community came forward to help, offering rides and meals, and even helping with Lucas. But despite the outpouring of support, Sophie felt as if she were drowning. Each day she visited Daniel, hoping for a sign of improvement, but his condition remained critical. Doctors warned her that even if he recovered physically, there could be lasting cognitive effects. One evening, as Sophie sat by his bedside, Daniel's eyes fluttered open, focusing on her for the first time. Relief washed over her, and she took his hand, her voice a trembling whisper. "Daniel, you're awake. You're back." But as she spoke, a look of confusion crossed his face, his eyes searching hers without recognition. Panic gripped her as he pulled his hand away, looking around the room as if he didn't know where he was. The doctors explained that memory loss and disorientation were common with head trauma, but Sophie felt devastated. Days passed, and Daniel remained distant, speaking only in short sentences, his once warm, familiar personality now replaced by someone she hardly recognized. He remembered little of their life together, and each attempt to jog his memory was met with confusion and frustration. His frustration, in turn, brought her a quiet agony that she kept hidden, not wanting him to see the heartbreak in her eyes. One afternoon, as she sat beside him in silence, Daniel looked at her, his face a mixture of pain and frustration. "I don't understand, Sophie," he said, his voice flat, distant. "Everyone keeps telling me that we were close. But I don't feel it. I don't remember it." His words hit her like a knife to the heart, and she felt her composure slip. "Daniel, please, we shared so much. You and Lucas, you became my family. We were building a life together," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But Daniel's gaze remained distant, his face unreadable. "I'm sorry, Sophie," he said quietly, looking away. "I just don't feel it." Those words lingered in the air, a cold, brutal reminder of the reality they were now facing. He wasn't the same man who had once filled her life with love and warmth, and she was left wondering if he ever would be. Despite the heartbreak, Sophie continued to visit him every day, hoping that with time, his memory might return, that the connection they had shared would spark again. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that Daniel's recovery would be slow, uncertain, and filled with setbacks. Some days he would be kind, even polite, but on others, he would become frustrated, questioning why she kept visiting, why she was holding on to a connection he couldn't feel. One day, as she sat alone in her living room after putting Lucas to bed, the weight of her reality crashed down on her. She sobbed quietly, her heart torn between the love she still felt for the man who was now a stranger and the crushing fear that the life they had built might never return. She clung to the memories, replaying each moment they had shared, reminding herself of the love they had once known. But the question haunted her, was she holding on to something that was gone? Days later, as she was leaving the hospital after another difficult visit, Sophie ran into Claire, who had heard about Daniel's accident. Claire's expression softened as she hugged Sophie tightly, sensing the pain she was carrying. "Sophie, you don't have to do this alone," Claire whispered, her voice filled with concern. "It's okay to lean on others. You've been there for all of us, let us be there for you now." With Claire's support, Sophie found the strength to keep going, though each day felt like an emotional marathon. The outreach program continued, and she poured herself into the work, finding solace in helping others. The community became her anchor, and while the pain of Daniel's absence lingered, she felt a quiet determination to keep moving forward, for herself and for Lucas. Weeks later, a small miracle happened. During one of her visits, Daniel looked at her with a faint glimmer of recognition. It wasn't much, just a flicker, but it was enough to reignite her hope. She reached for his hand, her heart pounding. "Daniel, do you remember?" she asked, her voice filled with anticipation. He looked at her, his expression softer than it had been in weeks. "I remember a little," he murmured, his eyes searching hers. "It's not clear, but I feel something." Sophie felt tears fill her eyes, a cautious joy spreading through her. She knew they had a long road ahead, that he might never fully remember their life together, but for the first time, she felt that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild. She held his hand, smiling through her tears. "Take your time, Daniel. We'll get through this, together." The glimmer of recognition in Daniel's eyes was fleeting, and Sophie quickly learned that recovery would not follow a straight path. There were moments of hope, like when he would ask about Lucas or mention a memory that seemed vaguely familiar. But those moments were often followed by days of confusion and frustration, when Daniel seemed to retreat even further into himself, his gaze distant and his demeanor cold. Each day felt like an emotional roller coaster, her heart constantly pulled between hope and despair. The doctors advised Sophie to prepare herself for the possibility that Daniel might never fully regain his memory of their life together. They explained that while he could recover some memories, others might be lost forever. It was a devastating truth, and Sophie could feel herself struggling to accept it. How was she supposed to let go of a life they had fought so hard to build? How could she face the future, knowing that the man who had once been her partner in every sense was now a stranger? One afternoon, after a particularly difficult visit where Daniel had barely spoken to her, Sophie returned home feeling utterly drained. She found Claire waiting on her doorstep, her face filled with quiet concern. Claire had become a steady presence in her life, offering comfort and support in ways that Sophie hadn't realized she needed. As Sophie unlocked the door, Claire placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "How was he today?" she asked softly, sensing the heaviness in Sophie's expression. Sophie let out a weary sigh, her voice thick with sadness. "He barely looked at me, Claire. It's like he's trying to shut me out, as if pushing me away will somehow make this easier for him." She paused, her voice breaking. "But I can't give up on him. I can't just walk away. What if there's still a chance he'll remember us?" Claire guided her inside, setting a kettle on the stove as Sophie sank onto the couch. "Sophie, no one expects you to walk away," she said gently. "You've been incredibly strong through all of this. But you also have to remember to take care of yourself. You've been pouring everything you have into Daniel's recovery, don't lose yourself in the process." As Claire's words sank in, Sophie felt a pang of guilt. She had become so focused on Daniel that she had barely allowed herself time to grieve the life they had lost, to acknowledge the emotional toll this was taking on her. She had been so desperate to hold on to the hope of his recovery that she had ignored her own needs, her own pain. She knew Claire was right, but the thought of stepping back, even slightly, felt like giving up. The next day, Sophie returned to the hospital, bracing herself for whatever mood Daniel might be in. But as she entered his room, she noticed something different. He was sitting by the window, staring outside, his expression softer than she had seen in weeks. She approached him slowly, unsure of how to begin, when he turned to her, a glimmer of something familiar in his eyes. "Sophie," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I've been thinking. I don't remember everything, but I know I used to feel something for you. I just don't know if I can feel that way again." His words hit her like a blow, but there was a vulnerability in his voice that told her he was struggling, too. She swallowed, forcing herself to stay calm. "Daniel, I know this is hard for you. I can't imagine what you're going through. But I'm here, and I'm not giving up on us," she replied, her voice trembling. "Maybe we can find a way to rebuild, even if it looks different from before." He looked away, a shadow passing over his face. "But what if I never become the man you remember?" he whispered, his voice filled with doubt. "What if I'm just this? I don't want to hurt you, Sophie. I don't want you to hold on to something that might never come back." Sophie's heart ached as she listened, realizing that he wasn't just struggling to remember, he was afraid of disappointing her, of failing to live up to the man he had once been. She reached for his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "Daniel, I don't expect you to be exactly who you were. I love who you are, right now. I love the man who still fights every day, who's trying even though this is the hardest thing you've ever faced." For a moment, he held her gaze, his eyes searching hers, as if looking for reassurance. But then he pulled his hand away, his face hardening. "I don't know if I can give you what you need, Sophie. Maybe it would be better if you let me go." His words cut deeply, and Sophie felt as though her heart was shattering. But she knew that leaving him, walking away, was something she couldn't do. In the following days, Sophie's struggle intensified. Lucas had started to sense the change in Daniel and grew increasingly quiet, his usual bright spirit dimmed by confusion and sadness. "Mom, why doesn't Mr. Daniel come home with us?" he asked one night, his small face filled with worry. Sophie knelt down, holding his hand as she searched for the right words. "Sweetheart, Mr. Daniel is very sick, and he needs time to get better. But we still love him, don't we?" she replied, her voice filled with a gentle strength she didn't fully feel. Lucas nodded, wrapping his arms around her. "I miss him," he whispered, and Sophie held him close, her own heart breaking as she realized that this wasn't just her pain, it was Lucas's, too. On one particularly difficult day, Sophie decided to take a short break from the hospital. She spent the afternoon with Lucas, taking him to a nearby park, letting him play while she sat alone on a bench, watching him from a distance. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the weight of everything she had been carrying, the fear, the sadness, the uncertainty. She let herself cry, the silent sobs releasing the grief she had been holding back. When she returned to the hospital later that evening, Daniel was awake, staring at the ceiling, his expression lost and empty. She sat beside him, her heart heavy as she reached for his hand, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how long this will take, Daniel. And I don't know if things will ever go back to the way they were. But I'm here. I'll keep showing up for you, even if you push me away, even if you don't understand why." He looked at her, something shifting in his gaze, and for a brief moment, she saw a flicker of the man she had once known. He squeezed her hand, his touch faint but deliberate. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a bridge, a fragile connection that gave her a reason to hold on, even in the midst of her heartache. As she left the hospital that night, Sophie felt both broken and resilient. She didn't know what the future held, or if Daniel would ever fully return to her. But she knew that she couldn't give up, not yet. She would keep fighting, keep hoping, and keep loving, even if it meant facing a future filled with uncertainty. And as she walked back to her car, the cool night air wrapped around her, a sense of quiet determination took hold. Months passed, and Sophie learned to live in a fragile balance between hope and acceptance. Every day with Daniel was an exercise in patience, a chance for her to rediscover resilience. The man she loved was still there, somewhere, but he was cloaked in layers of uncertainty, fragments of the past scattered across the fragile present they now shared. Sophie stayed by his side, though each visit was a mix of joy and heartbreak. Lucas, too, continued to visit, his young heart resilient yet visibly softened, his bright spirit tempered by a maturity beyond his years. One evening, as Sophie was sitting by Daniel's bedside, he surprised her with a question she hadn't anticipated. "What made you stay?" he asked quietly, his eyes distant yet searching. It was a question he'd asked before, but tonight, something was different in his tone, a kind of wonder, as though he was seeing her for the first time. Sophie felt her heart swell as she looked at him, her fingers lightly tracing the outline of his hand, their connection like a fragile thread. "I stayed because I love you, Daniel," she said, her voice steady, filled with all the pain and beauty they had endured together. "Because no matter what, you're a part of me. I couldn't walk away from that, even if it's not always easy." A flicker of recognition softened his gaze, and he nodded slowly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. For the first time in months, she saw a glimpse of the man she had fallen in love with, the warmth in his eyes, the quiet strength she'd always admired. He squeezed her hand gently, and in that small act, Sophie felt a glimmer of hope. As the weeks wore on, Daniel began to regain more of his memories. They came in flashes, small moments, details, fragments of their life together. He remembered Lucas's laugh, their first picnic, the sound of Sophie's voice when she called his name. With each memory, he seemed to grow stronger, more like the Daniel she had known. It was a slow, delicate process, but Sophie stayed with him every step of the way, her heart swelling with cautious optimism. One afternoon, Sophie brought Lucas to the hospital for another visit. As they entered the room, Daniel looked at them with an expression of calm recognition. He held out his hand, and Lucas rushed forward, wrapping his small arms around him. "I missed you, Mr. Daniel," he murmured, his voice filled with unguarded affection. Daniel's voice was soft but clear as he replied, "I missed you too, buddy." He looked at Sophie, his gaze filled with a tenderness she hadn't seen in so long. "Thank you for being my family, even when I couldn't remember." His voice was steady, each word carrying the weight of his journey back to them. Sophie felt tears fill her eyes, her heart brimming with gratitude. From that moment, Daniel's progress accelerated. The pieces of their life together began to fall back into place, one by one, until he was able to leave the hospital. Sophie brought him home, the place they had filled with love and laughter, and as he stepped inside, she saw the wonder and joy in his eyes. He reached for her hand, holding it tightly as he took in their home, their life, everything they had built together. It felt like a homecoming, not just for him, but for the love they had fought so hard to protect. In the following weeks, Daniel reconnected with his old life and rediscovered his role in the outreach program, working alongside Sophie and the community that had supported them both. He was different, quieter, more introspective, but his love for Sophie and Lucas was as strong as ever, deepened by the trials they had faced. He understood now, more than ever, the fragility of life, and he cherished each moment they shared. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Daniel turned to Sophie, his expression filled with gratitude. "I feel like I've been given a second chance, not just at life, but at love, at family," he said, his voice filled with quiet awe. "I don't know how I'll ever thank you for staying, for believing in us." Sophie smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek. "You don't have to thank me, Daniel. We're here because we fought for each other. And I'd do it all over again if I had to." She looked at him, her heart overflowing with love. "We're stronger now because of what we've been through. This is our second chance, and I know we'll make the most of it." As they sat together, Lucas nestled between them. Sophie felt a peace settle over her, a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known before. They had faced heartbreak, loss, and uncertainty, but they had come through it together, bound by a love that had grown even stronger in the face of hardship. In the months that followed, Sophie and Daniel built a life that was both familiar and new, filled with purpose, gratitude, and a deeper understanding of the bond they shared. They continued their work in the community, helping others who struggled, knowing firsthand the power of resilience and love. Their home became a place of healing, not only for themselves but for those who sought refuge and understanding. One evening, as they watched the sun set from their porch, Daniel took Sophie's hand, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "No matter what happens, I want you to know that I'm here for you, always. I may have lost my memory, but I'll never forget the love we share." He leaned in, his lips brushing hers with a tenderness that spoke of all they had endured. Sophie held him close, her heart filled with a joy she hadn't thought possible. Together, they had journeyed through darkness and found the light on the other side. They were no longer just surviving, they were living, fully and completely, with a love that was stronger than ever. And as the stars began to fill the sky, they sat together, grateful for the life they had reclaimed, the family they had fought for, and the future they would face, side by side, with a love that would carry them through whatever came next. If you like this story, take the opportunity to see the others that are appearing on your screen right now. Subscribe to the channel and comment on what you thought of this story. See you soon. Bye.